The fifth proactive change strategy we're looking at is overseas manufacturing. So we're changing and looking towards the future opportunities, and we're saying, why don't we change how and where the product's made? And why don't we actually make it overseas? So what does that look like? Well, we would say it's also called offshoring. So you might see that in some of the textbooks. Same thing, overseas manufacturing is offshoring. The business itself sets up operations in another country and then produces the output itself in that country. But we still have some operations in Australia. Maybe not all of the operations, but we might just have a head office, like the office part of it. But we're still got a presence in Australia. So what does that look like? Well, one of the previous strategies we looked at was when we source our inputs from overseas. That was a little bit different to this. We had an operation system, the inputs, the resources used to produce the output. We transform them, and then we end up with a final output, a good or a service. Well, we said when we globally source inputs, we keep the operation system in Australia. So we use Darrell Lea as an example. We might get the sugar from China. We might get the web design for the business done in India, and we might get the milk from France. But we're still producing the product in Australia, still using Australian employees. We're going to change that. We're going to say with this one, that's global sourcing of inputs. Here we're talking about completely manufacturing something overseas. So instead of making this block of chocolate here in Australia, we're going to move production to another country. So we're actually going to shift the operation system. In this case, let's say China. Okay, so the product is actually not going to get made in Australia anymore. It is going to get made in China. We'll still say we're an Australian business. We might have a head office here, and we promote ourselves as Australian. And a lot of the parts of the product, the input might be Australian, but fundamentally that product is actually a Chinese product in this case, being sent back to Australia as a finished product. We're manufacturing it overseas. So what are the strengths and advantages and disadvantages of this? Well, it's going to get lower input costs and higher net profits. It's usually cheaper to produce in a foreign country where wages, taxes, and inputs are lower. Then we can pass that on to consumers. That means we're going to have lower prices. We get more sales, more market share. But probably the best thing is we're going to capitalize on national competitive advantages. So what does that mean? It means that some countries are just good at things. They're better at things than other countries. So who makes the best cars? Generally Germany. Who makes the best electronics? China, for example. There's not many things left in Australia that we're best at. So it probably makes sense to sort of go overseas, get the best skills we can, and then actually make that product in that particular market. You're capitalizing on the competitive advantage of an entire country. What is bad about this? Very difficult and expensive. You've got to not only just find suppliers and so on, like with some of our other strategies, you've got to set up a whole operation system in a new country. You might not know anything about that business, that country and how it works. We have no infrastructure in place, so everything is going to cost money to set up. Now, we also open ourselves up to the fluctuations in exchange rates. So because we're dealing overseas and things are going to be coming back and forth into Australia, we're going to have to buy foreign currencies, and generally we lose money on that. There's going to be tariffs, which are taxes that governments place when things come through into the ports of the country. But probably the biggest one again is the cultural language barriers. You've got to basically set up a whole operation system in another country. You mightn't be familiar with that country. You mightn't speak the language, but there could also be time differences. So just when you have a query during business hours in Australia from 9 to 5, that doesn't mean the people in that country are working. How do you get that resolved immediately? And that's another consideration when you are going to set up overseas manufacturing.